"Turn it off, Grandpa! No one's listening!" The boy sighed as Walter powered up the old PRC radio. Same time, same frequency, just like he'd done more than 10,000 mornings before. He didn't argue, just tuned the dial. Static filled the room. Then, something shifted, a crackle, a sound he hadn't heard in decades. He froze, hand trembling over the mic, because today, something was different. If you believe some promises should never be forgotten, comment, respect, and share this story. The porch boards groaned as Walter Hayes stepped into the morning dark. He moved with the kind of slowness that wasn't weakness. It was intention. Every movement had its place. His boots were laced the same way they had been in the jungle. His watch still ran 5 minutes fast, just like it had when time could mean life or death. The sky above the Montana hills was heavy with fog, clinging low like breath on a mirror. The world hadn't quite woken up yet, but Walter had been up for hours. Out back, behind the house, stood a small wooden shed with a slanted roof and a rusted padlock that hadn't seen a key in 10 years. It never closed anymore. The door creaked open under his calloused hand. Inside, a workbench, oil-stained rags, a rusted coffee can filled with stripped bolts, and in the center, protected by a faded tarp, was the heart of his mornings, the PRC-77. Olive drab, dented left panel, still operational. He uncovered it with care as if it were something sacred. To him, it was. Walter sat down on the steel stool with the ripped cushion. He adjusted the knobs like a man playing an old instrument. He knew every movement by muscle memory. Then he pressed the power switch. Static filled the shed like breath. He waited, not for a sound, not even for a word, just presence. A trace, a flicker, a ghost of something. He keyed the mic. Echo 5, standing by for Echo 7. Confirm if able. He let go. The static answered, same as always. Then he reached for the notebook. Composition style, frayed at the edges. Today's date, written in pencil. Weather, fog, low wind. Signal strength, constant. Status, no contact. He closed the book, set it down with the others. There were 37 of them now. One for every year since he started listening. He had them labeled by year. None of them had what he was still waiting to hear. Behind him, he heard a yawn. The door creaked open. Eli, his grandson, 13, tired, hoodie thrown over his head. "You do this every day?" Walter didn't turn. He just nodded once. "Before sunrise." Eli stepped inside, wrinkling his nose at the mix of oil and old metal. He pointed at the radio. "That thing's like from World War I or something?" "Vietnam," Walter corrected. "PRC-77, first issued in '68. I kept mine." "Why?" Walter hesitated. "Because no one else would." Eli looked around the shed. His eyes caught the shelf full of notebooks, the wires taped along the beams, the weathered photos pinned to the wall, men in green, arms slung around each other, jungle behind them, fear buried under bravado. "You waiting for someone?" the boy asked. Walter's hands paused over the dials. His voice dropped. "Raymond Dandridge, Hawk." Eli squinted. "Who's that?" "Unit commander. Last I saw him, he was covering our exit in Cambodia. Told me to get the rest of the squad out." "And you think he's still out there?" Walter finally turned. His face was calm, but not soft. "I know he never made it home." Eli was quiet for a while. Then he said, half laughing, "You've been listening to static for 30 years because of a promise?" Walter looked at the boy for a long time. Not angry, not defensive, just steady. "Some people think loyalty ends when the war does," he said. "They're wrong." The static hissed on, filling the space between them. Eli didn't speak again. He just sat down on the workbench edge, watching his grandfather, maybe for the first time, not as a relic, but as a man. And in that silence, Walter picked up the mic again. Echo 5, still standing by. The fog still clung to the trees when Walter returned to the house. Eli had gone back to bed, but Walter didn't sleep much anymore. Hadn't in years. He set a kettle on the stove, pulled out the tin of coffee grounds, and let the stillness wrap around him like a coat he never took off. The radio didn't speak this morning, But that wasn't new. He poured the water, black and bitter, into the mug with the chipped handle. On the side, 5th Infantry Black Knights. The letters had faded, but he could still feel them with his thumb. On the table beside the mug sat a photo. 6 men, jungle behind them. One of them, tall, squared shoulders, left arm slung around Walter's neck. Raymond Dandridge, call sign, Hawk. Walter stared at it like a man rereading a story only he knew the ending to. Cambodia, 1975. Officially, they weren't there. Unofficially, they were running recon missions, so close to the border that some maps didn't even label the ground they walked on. 6 men, 2 radios, 1 extraction point, and everything went to hell before dawn. Walter had taken fire near the creek bend, lost 1 antenna, nearly lost the second man trying to repair it. Ray had been hit clean, through the right shoulder, high and deep, but he didn't fall, didn't scream. "Get the others out," he told Walter, blood already darkening the front of his fatigues. "We go together," Walter said, already calling in coordinates. "No." Ray's eyes locked on his. "You have the only working set. You leave, or we all die here." More gunfire cracked. The tree line burst open. Walter fired back, dragging their third man, Corporal Diaz, by the belt strap. 5 miles south. "Extraction window in 10, Ray shouted, already moving the opposite direction. "I'll buy you time." Walter looked back once, just once. Ray was standing alone in the clearing, M1911 in one hand, the other clutching his side, facing down a shadow line of enemy rifles. That was the last image he carried. Back home, the paperwork called it MIA. 2 years later, it was changed to presumed KIA. But Walter never filed the mental form. He had made a call on that radio before the bird lifted them out. "Echo 7. If you're alive, I'll be listening. Same channel, same time, every day." He'd been doing it ever since. Walter tried to go back to civilian life. He tried the factory. He tried carpentry. He even tried teaching history for 2 semesters, but nothing fit. Until one morning, someone at the VA mentioned a small ranger station up in northern Montana. Needed someone comfortable with isolation. Quiet place, high elevation, decent radio range. He took the job that same week, but he didn't go for the scenery. He went because he knew he'd have a roof, power, and just enough distance from everyone who had stopped believing. Years passed. New wars came. People moved on. But Walter's mornings never changed. People laughed, said it was grief, PTSD, denial. Even his own son eventually stopped asking about the static. But Walter never missed a transmission. To him, the world might forget the name Raymond Dandridge, but the signal wouldn't. On the wall above his workbench, nailed crookedly into the wood, was a single sheet of laminated paper. It was yellowed now, curling at the edges. But in bold letters, typewritten by Walter himself, it read, "Some promises aren't made to be broken. Some voices are just waiting for silence to end." The next morning, the wind had changed. Walter felt it before he opened the door. Not in the trees, not in the sky. In his ribs, in the quiet weight behind the air. He stepped into the shed, as he always did. Same time, same steps, but something felt off. The static was louder today, not in volume, just in presence, like it was pressing against the walls instead of sitting quietly between them. He adjusted the frequency twice, then once more. He never had to before. The hiss faded, returned, then sharpened, like glass under a shoe. He keyed the mic. "Echo 5, standing by for Echo 7. Confirm if able." He released the button, waited. Pencil ready, notebook open, nothing. He reached for the mug of coffee that Eli had left on the corner of the bench. It had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. Then, a shift. Not a sound at first. A texture. The kind only a man who's heard silence too long can recognize. A moment when the static didn't feel like static anymore. He leaned forward. Then, just beneath the white noise, Echo 7. Walter didn't move, not even to breathe. A crackle. Then, still breathing. He dropped the pencil. The notebook slipped. His hand hovered over the mic, trembling. Not from age this time. He pressed it slowly. His voice came out quieter than he meant. "Say again." "Echo 7, confirm." "Say again." No reply. Just the return of the familiar static, like it had never happened. That afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of him. He read the line over and over. Echo 7. Still breathing. His handwriting looked foreign, shaky, uncertain, unlike every other log he had written for 3 decades. He didn't speak of it. Not to Eli, not to anyone. That night, he barely slept. He dreamed of Ray, not as he had last seen him, bleeding, surrounded, defiant, but younger, laughing in the mess tent, chewing gum that didn't exist. His laugh was always louder than it needed to be. Ray had once said, "If they hear you laugh, maybe they'll aim worse." Walter woke in sweat. At 5:25 sharp, he was back in the shed. The second day, the transmission came again. Echo 7, Ridge, cold. The rest was garbled, unclear, but real. He marked the entry. This time, his hand was steady. He reached for the old military contact list tucked in a tin box beneath the workbench. Most numbers were long dead, but one still rang. The man who answered was Sergeant First Class Robert Mears, retired. He had served with Walter in the late 70s, long after Cambodia, but he remembered the story. He didn't laugh. He didn't doubt. He just said, "Let me make some calls." By the third day, a visitor arrived. Not military, not official, civilian clothes, government eyes. He introduced himself only as Aaron, said he worked with communications infrastructure for the Department of Defense. But Walter knew better. This wasn't someone from the phone company. Aaron asked to see the notebook. He didn't question its authenticity. He took photos of each page, every signal strength, every anomaly Walter had logged. Then he asked a question no one had ever asked in 30 years. "Have you ever recorded the transmissions?" Walter nodded once, reached under the bench and pulled out a cassette recorder. Dusty, but labeled, organized, 1 tape per year. Aaron didn't blink, just said, "I need to run some of this through a cleaner." He paused, then looked at Walter more directly. "If this is what I think it is, you might have just made contact with someone no one believed was alive." Walter didn't react, didn't smile, didn't even blink. He only said, "I told him I'd be listening." The cassette tapes didn't lie. Neither did the coordinates embedded in the broken voice Aaron cleaned up that night. Ridge, 3 clicks, Ban, Hawaii, Laos. Walter sat still as the room grew darker around him, the radio's orange glow casting faint shadows over the peeling maps. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the tape spinning slowly, looping a whisper that no one else had heard for 30 years. By morning, 2 more men arrived. One was clearly military. Haircut too clean, posture too sharp, eyes scanning every corner of the shed. The other wore plain clothes and no name badge, but walked like a man who outranked everyone without needing to say it. They introduced themselves briefly, didn't ask permission, just said, "Mr. Hayes, we believe your logbooks are credible." They called it unofficial intelligence, but they treated it like scripture. They laid out equipment Walter hadn't seen since the Gulf, long-range interceptors, encrypted relays, even a portable uplink satellite, all packed into 3 black cases that looked too clean for a place like his. But they didn't mock the shed, didn't laugh at the age of the PRC-77. They treated it like something sacred. One of them asked if he could place a gloved hand on the panel. Walter just nodded. For the first time since the war, Walter wasn't alone in the room, and not a single one of them made noise when he keyed the mic. "Echo 5, responding to Echo 7. Request confirm. Are you able?" They waited. The static hung heavy. Then, "Still here. Ridge confirmed." The voice was weak, strained, but it came through. No one moved. The plainclothes man removed his glasses. The younger officer swallowed hard. Walter didn't need to look at them. He just whispered, "He's still alive." News didn't spread. Not the kind you see on screens. But the town changed anyway. Eli started coming to the shed every morning without being asked. He didn't talk much, just handed Walter coffee and waited. The sheriff passed by the property line one morning and tipped his hat. A man who once called Walter the old signal ghost. The local hardware store, without a word, sent a delivery of new cables and replacement parts. No charge. And on the fifth morning, a black SUV pulled up the dirt road. A man stepped out, dressed in full uniform, chest heavy with ribbons. Colonel David Harrelson. He shook Walter's hand without formality. "Sir, I've read your records. You've logged over 11,000 days of monitoring. On behalf of the United States Army, thank you for never standing down." Walter didn't answer. He simply opened the door and pointed to the table. The colonel saw the 37 notebooks, each one marked, each one filled. He looked at Walter like a man seeing a monument that shouldn't exist. "We've triangulated the signal," he said quietly. "Special Operations is preparing a response." Walter didn't ask when, didn't ask how. He just asked, "Are they going for him?" The colonel nodded. "We never leave one behind." That night, Walter sat on the porch with Eli. The radio was off for the first time in years. "I thought you were just chasing ghosts," the boy said, careful with his words. Walter looked at the horizon, the last of the light bleeding out behind the trees. "So did everyone else," he said. "But ghosts don't breathe. That voice, that's Ray, that's Hawk." Eli was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I think I'd have given up." Walter shook his head. "That's because you haven't made a promise like that yet." They didn't give Walter details, only a message. He's coming home. Raymond Hawk Dandridge had been found by a joint recovery team along the Latian border. Underweight, weathered, alive. 30 years living among hill tribes, moving between caves, speaking only when safe, and always, whenever possible, tuning in. Same time, same channel, same words. Echo 7, still breathing. He had held on, not because he believed in governments or medals, but because he believed in one man still listening. The plane touched down on a foggy morning. No press, no parade. Only a plain green Humvee and 3 men waiting at the airfield. Walter stood by the hangar in his old field jacket. His cane rested at his side, untouched. Eli stood a step behind him, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes locked on the door ramp. It lowered slow, metal on metal, and then he saw him. Not the man from the photo. Not the man in jungle camo, laughing with a cigar in one hand. This man was older, thinner, but his eyes, they were exactly the same. Ray's hand trembled as he reached the tarmac. He wore no uniform, just borrowed boots and a hospital-issued coat. He looked up, squinted, then he smiled. Walter stepped forward. No handshakes, no salutes, just 2 men closing the space of 3 decades in silence. Ray stopped 1 step away. "You waited," he said, voice gravel and memory. Walter nodded once. "You answered." They sat for hours that first day. No interviews, no visitors, just coffee, black, in mugs that didn't match. Walter told him about the shed, the notebooks, the 11,000 log entries. Ray told him about the caves, the tribe that hid him, the makeshift antennas. Both men spoke slowly, not because they were old, but because when time teaches you how to wait, it also teaches you how to speak. A week later, the colonel returned. He handed Walter a plaque with an engraved message and 3 stars pinned in the corner. Walter read it once, then tucked it away in a drawer. "I already got what I came for," he said. The town changed, too. The sheriff stopped by with a framed photo of Ray, freshly printed, and hung it in the city hall lobby. A small group of veterans gathered one morning to place a bronze plate outside Walter's shed. It read, "This room heard nothing," until one man refused to stop listening. Eli designed a small exhibit in the local library. It held the oldest of the logbooks, and the tape labeled Day 11-278, the one with the first words, "Still breathing." They never made a documentary. They refused every offer. No interviews, no books, no headlines. Every Thursday at 05:30, Ray walked to Walter's porch. He carried 2 mugs, 1 for each. They sat with the old radio between them. They didn't turn it on anymore, not because it was over, but because finally someone had answered. They say time heals everything, but Walter Hayes knew better. Time didn't heal. It just tested you. And in his case, it tested whether you'd keep showing up long after the world stopped watching. Ray moved into a small house just 2 streets down. Veterans from 3 counties pitched in for the repairs. Eli helped with the front steps. And Walter, well, he came by with oil for the hinges and a pair of folding chairs for the porch. They didn't talk much about the years in between. Some stories stay between uniforms and silence. But there were mornings when Ray would lean back, sip his coffee, and say things like, "The radio was all I had. Hearing you, even in silence, it kept me sane." And Walter would nod, then point to the horizon, then sit quietly, knowing that not everything has to be said. At the local high school, they started teaching the Jennings Protocol, not as a radio strategy, but as a lesson in discipline, patience, and loyalty. The first page of the curriculum showed a photo of Walter sitting in his shed, the notebooks stacked like bricks beside him. The caption read, "Every day, same time, same call, not because someone might answer, but because someone said they would." Ray's health improved slowly. The deep scars on his arms would never fade. But his posture changed. He walked straighter, laughed more. He even learned how to send text messages, though Walter still preferred paper and pencil. They had a new ritual now. Every Thursday, instead of turning on the radio, they'd sit outside and read 1 page from the old notebooks. Sometimes Ray would laugh. Sometimes he'd just stare at a number, a date, a small annotation like unusual burst 0531. And he'd say, "I remember that day. I was alive. Just couldn't speak." One afternoon, Eli asked Walter a question. They were alone in the shed. The old radio still sat on the bench, quiet but not forgotten. "Why didn't you give up? After all those years?" Walter didn't answer right away. He opened one of the notebooks, ran his fingers across the first page. "Because I said I wouldn't." Eli nodded slowly, as if it was only now he understood. Then he asked, "Was it worth it?" Walter looked at the radio, at the empty chair across from it, at the silence that used to hurt, but now felt like peace. "It wasn't about being right," he said. "It was about being there." When Walter passed, it was quiet. No cameras, no ceremony. But on the morning of his funeral, a group of veterans, old and young, gathered in the shed before sunrise. At 0530, one of them, a lieutenant, keyed the mic of the restored PRC 77 and said, "Echo 5, this is Echo 7. We're still listening." Then they stood in silence for 60 full seconds. No static, just presence. To this day, every November, on the anniversary of the first signal, the local radio tower is tuned to a single channel. The broadcast is simple. A man's voice recorded years earlier. Echo 5, standing by. It plays once, and then the station goes silent for the rest of the hour. Because some things aren't meant to fill space. Some things are meant to echo, long after the voice is gone. If you believe that some promises should never be broken, and that silence is sometimes the most faithful reply, comment respect below. And if you want to hear more true stories of dignity, loyalty, and quiet courage, subscribe now. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.